Well, I hope everyone is enjoying the program. I think we've had just some tremendous testimony here and validation for the Cove and for Jersey City as an emerging cluster for tech and life science. And so I hope by now we've made all of you as excited as we are. We have two more great panels coming up to finish the day. There is beer and wine in the back, so please help yourself if you'd like to relax during the last portion of the program. And of course, we have a reception that will be following up at the end. So our next panel is on yet another pillar of transformation, which is social equity. And what is the role that diversity, workforce development, and affordability play in building an innovation community like this and ensuring that the economic benefits are really enjoyed by everyone, all communities, and people with all different personal characteristics as well. We all just came through the pandemic. We saw the uneven impact that this disease had on different communities in New York and New Jersey. And we need to make sure that when we're building a community like this and around issues of health and wellness and accessibility, that all of those communities are considered. So that's what our panel is going to talk about. We have Karen Ingram from BioBuilder. She's a BioBuilder developer and co-author of the textbook BioBuilder Educational Foundation. And you have some things to raffle off today, don't you? Yes. She has, what, 5 of your textbooks? 6.
Yeah.
So these are actually quite fun and quite interesting. And they're all about introducing a new way of learning about biology, right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And Veena, and I'm never going to pronounce your last name right. What is it? Vijayakumar, Program Director of Biodesign Challenge. This is an organization and program near and dear to my heart. Dan Grishkin, the founder, is in our audience, and I worked with him at the inception to get this launched, and he is now international, and I mean international, so it's pretty impressive. Joel Sanders, who is the principal architect and a professor at Yale Architecture, who is not in person, but he is joining us by video today from Helsinki. Marilynn Davis, Chief Real Estate Officer of Clark Atlanta University. Thank you very much. Love your necklace. And Dave Micklos, the Executive Director of Cold Spring Harbor DNA Learning Center. He's doing amazing work throughout the city and beyond. I first became aware of him when I was running the New York Genome Center, and so he'll tell you about his work as well. So why don't we get started by just, all of you sharing your thoughts from the perspective of the organizations that you're working with and running about social equity, because everybody brings a different perspective on this panel.
Yeah, I mean, one of the core tenets of BioBuilder is to bring cutting-edge research and learning curricula to a broad audience. So we do that through the BioBuilder textbook, which, as Nancy mentioned, I have 6 copies for you guys. And we also do it through the BioBuilder Club and through teacher training and through workforce development, which is working with local entities to create novel programs through partnerships. So it's a multifaceted approach to ensuring equity.
And you're national in scope, right?
Yes, national and international, yes.
And you're working with school systems throughout the country?
Yes, yeah.
This is another organization that got started, what, maybe 10 years ago?
10 years ago, yeah. It's our 10-year anniversary, yeah.
And they're now national, so. Yeah. And this is, BioBuilder is actually part of a community in the synthetic biology community. And that's not a community that's often talked about, but it is one that will be of growing importance in the years ahead. So mostly life science has been therapeutically oriented up until now. which is discovering new medicines and diagnostics for human disease. Synthetic biology is really about writing the genome to create new biological materials. And that means that there will be applications in chemicals and new types of materials and energy and food. And so this is all where you hear about the impossible foods, right? And all of the new products that are being built in the lab that we used to use animals for. And so this will help us to create a more sustainable planet. And organizations like the Biodesign Challenge are actually helping people to envision new products, right?
Yeah, and coming off of what you were saying, Nancy, as this technology is emerging and rapidly emerging, we want as many people to contribute to the dialogue as possible from different backgrounds, from disciplinary backgrounds to socioeconomic backgrounds to cultural backgrounds. So I think that's our main goal right now. With the Biodesign Challenge, we pair high school and university students with artists, designers, biologists to envision futures of biotech. So we want kids at a very young age to be able to see the technology, to see how it's being used right now and how it can be used in the future. So the more we have students from backgrounds that are not always considered, the better, right? The more voices that we have that are contributing to the conversation.
So you're doing that really in two ways, right? One is culturally.
Yes.
How many countries are you in now?
Wow, this past year in 2021, we were in 20 countries around the world. And we started in 2015. We were just in the US in 9 universities. And we hit 53 last year, 53 schools. So.
53 schools in 20 countries?
Yes.
Yeah. That's incredible in terms of the amount of cultural diversity. And they have a international competition every year that was held at MoMA and has been held virtually the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And to see the student teams that come from around the world and have dreamed up these new products is just incredible. But the second way that you're promoting diversity is through your work with Title I schools. Can you say what Title I schools are and what is the genesis of that idea?
Yes, so Biodesign Challenge is our main program. We just started a new initiative called BDC After School. And Title I schools, we're focusing on the US. Title I schools are schools that have at least 40% of students on free or reduced lunch, so from low-income families. So we are specifically looking at these schools to bring the science education, informal science education aspect to it, to give the students the opportunity to see themselves in these positions by making and by doing in a more informal space.
And it's probably one of the first times these kids have been exposed to these kinds of things, right?
Yeah, I don't want to speak without data because we're just starting to build it, but I think anecdotally we've had an instructor in the past years that are teaching in Title I schools, and many of the students have not seen lab equipment before that, and they're getting the opportunity to work with it too.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
And Marilynn,
Yes.
from a university perspective, can you share with us, what you're doing?
Sure. Clark Atlanta University is the result of a merger about 33 years ago between two historically Black institutions that were founded in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. Atlanta University, which was the first, became the first university to offer graduate degrees to a primarily African-American institution, and Clark College, which was the first institution to offer liberal arts degrees to a primarily African-American institution. So the issues of equity have been literally in our DNA for the past 150 years or so. We have been located, the two schools are we're part of the Atlanta University Center, which along with Spelman, Morehouse School of Medicine, comprise the largest consortium of HBCUs probably in the world. We have decided, we're located in a community that's been distressed for some time. It was, in its heyday, and then sort of in the 60s, it really became distressed as more options and more competition and undercapitalization and all the other things happened. We still have quite a lot of land in the community in large chunks. 15 acres, 22 acres, 8, 9 acres. It can be, if properly developed, can be transformative. And so our intention now, and this all happens, of course, at the time when higher ed institutions are looking for something other than tuition and fees for solid revenues, and shoring up their financial underpinnings. We're looking at developing that real estate. And so many of the issues related to how you develop something at scale that can, of the scale, say, of the Cove, that can really speak to all of the issues of social equity and leveraging many of the intellectual assets that the university has as well, or what we're thinking about.
Yeah, so one of the things that we talked about the other day, which you so eloquently talked about in terms of being of extreme importance, is the size and scale of these kinds of developments usually are about displacement, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about putting something down and driving people from where they live. And that can't happen anymore. I mean, all of the people that live in a community need to be incorporated in it in order to have health and wellness in a community, right? Or any of the rest of the things we've been talking about.
Well, yes, and just the business angle of it, the practical business angle of it would require that some serious consideration be given to these kinds of communities. Unfortunately, innovation communities don't have a good track record in terms of starting with Silicon Valley, and then certainly Cambridge and others don't have a good track record of being inclusive. And so what we're really thinking about is, for us, there are sort of 3 pillars aside from the placemaking aspect, but incorporated into that, one needs to, housing options that can create wealth, not just income, which is great, but wealth creation, which is much more important because it has multi-generational impacts. Entrepreneurship, supporting that, and education. And our university has expertise and intellectual assets which can help us formulate that as part of communities that are forward-thinking, that are inclusive, that build a sense of community and keep people where they are if they want to be there.
Yeah.
Recognizing that the neighborhood is going to change. It's going to change for the better, but we all have to learn how to live together.
Right, exactly. And Dave, tell us a little bit about your work with Cold Spring Harbor and the DNA Learning Labs.
Sure. Well, I come from a little institution, but with a big reputation.
Yes. So there are slides for Dave. Can we get the slides up?
Well, I don't have to do the slide.
Okay.
It's okay. No one else is. My institution has a small size but a big reputation. And when we started to do outreach and education in 1988 and started a center, we had a problem with diversity because on Long Island is not particularly diverse.
So Cold Spring Harbor is on Long Island.
That's correct.
And your record of leadership is all these Nobel Prize winners, right?
Yeah, we have 8 Nobel Prize winners who have
Just to clarify.
called it home. Yes, they're big shoes to fill. But so we have an inherent problem on the North Shore of Long Island, which is not very diverse. So although we started offering programs for kids in 1988, we realized that if we wanted to do a good job with reaching a diverse population with the labs that we do with kids, that we would need to move into New York City. And we started with a site in Harlem, 120th Street and First Avenue, inside of a public school. That's still going, and there we found exactly what we thought was if we came to a place with a diverse population, of course, we would reach those kids. Just last week, we opened a big new center in downtown Brooklyn where we want to expand upon that work that we do. In one of the opening talks, when they showed the research dollars in the New York metropolitan area, there were lots of circles of institutions with quite a lot of support. But on Long Island, there were two pretty big circles. One was Stony Brook, but the other one was Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, where I work. If I could say one final thing, after having done this for 35 years, I realized that the biggest difference between a wealthy school and a poor school is the ability to give kids a significant research experience. There's about 125 school districts on Long Island. Virtually every one of them has a multi-year research program for kids. In New York City, there's virtually none. Now, the data show really clearly from the university level, and they're very, very good data, that if a student has a significant research experience in their freshman year, and this is done in all the best universities now, that significant research experience, kids that have that are 20% more likely to stay in science. That's called retention. And they're 20% more likely to graduate on time. Now, the second thing is really significant, because what that says is that the research experience has influences on students far beyond becoming a scientist. It makes you a better thinker and a better student. So I say that if a student is ready for research, they're ready for life, they're ready for careers, they're ready for further schooling. So we're trying in New York City to level the playing field in one big way by offering public schools the ability to do those kind of research programs that the fancy schools on Long Island have had for 35 years.
So what kind of programs are those?
Well, the research programs typically have kids learn methods of science. They can learn them, through projects and different things. The other panelists here do lots of those things. But ultimately, you have to have an experience that lets you come up with a problem, use tools and methods of science to solve that problem, have difficulties along the way and have to reiterate, collaborate with other students, and present your work. And the more parts of that research process that a kid can do, the more of this impact you'll have of them staying with science and doing well in school.
Great, and I want to put a question to Joel now, who, as I said, is joining us from Europe. So Joel, you have a slightly different perspective on social equity, coming at it from an accessibility perspective and a design perspective. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, and greetings from Helsinki. And so, in 2018, I established a new branch of my architectural studio, JSA, and it's called Mixed Design. And we're a think tank and a design consultancy dedicated to considering the needs of a broad segment of the population that I would argue that the discipline of architecture has overlooked. And we refer to these populations as quote unquote non-compliant bodies. People of different ages, genders, races, and abilities that fall out of the cultural mainstream, and I think for the most part have been overlooked by designers. And so we're dedicated to working with progressive architects to combat this legacy of exclusion in architecture and to apply what we call an inclusive design approach, whose outcome is to develop toolkits, recommendations, and prototypes for making everyday building types like those found at the Cove, offices, workplaces, laboratories, educational places, even cultural institutions, safe and accessible for a wide spectrum of people with different identities and embodiments. And the last thing I would just say in general is that we try to build on but differentiate ourselves from other important approaches to accessibility like ADA and universal design. And we cast a wider net, and we think intersectionally. And what do I mean by that? We believe that human experience and the experience in the built environment is based upon on having to examine a variety of intersecting factors. We consider disability, people with mobility, sensory, and neurodiversity challenges, gender, women, trans, non-binary people, and culture, the spatial requirements associated with race, religion, et cetera. And second, we believe strongly in engagement, that if we're going to create inclusive spaces that produce a sense of health, wellness, and well-being, and a sense of belonging, that you need the active participation of the stakeholders and the end users, or in the case of the Cove, the people who not only will be working in this complex, but also the members of the local community who are often overlooked in the process. And I think that what I would advocate, what we advocate for all the projects that we do, and I think what would be very useful as the Cove moves forward, would be to conduct surveys, interviews, workshops, and focus groups that yield meaningful feedback so that the design of the Cove really reflects the lived experience of the end users who are going to be using the space.
So that's really interesting. Are any of the standards or certifications, like the wellness standard, do they actually include the the characteristics that you're talking about, or any of the tools or processes that you might recommend?
Well, I'm not sure I'm answering the question, and I would. What I would say is this, that I think that most approaches to diversity and inclusion that think about space, like the ADA, okay, I think they're important, but I think they tend to have a separate but equal approach. And I think, in other words, that they offer accommodations that focus, I think, for the most part, on people with disabilities, mobility issues, and to a limited extent, people with sensory issues. So, in other words, I wish I could say, look at these standards and apply them. But I think what we and my colleagues and other colleagues around the world are now trying to do increasingly is develop a new way of working, new forms of engagement processes that, again, think intersectionally across race, gender, culture, neurodiversity, as well as religion. Okay, so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I hope that the outcome could be a set of, let's call it recommendations. I don't believe in standards, okay? But I believe that we need to develop a new set of robust standards that allow end user engagement and feedback to produce spaces that are tailored to meet the unique needs of specific populations, in this case, the people who will live and work in local communities for the Cove. Yes. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you. So that is a very different approach than has generally been taken. Where has this been implemented?
Well, I mean, again, at the risk of sounding self-serving, we're implementing it. Me and my colleagues, we have a network of people that sort of people with expertise that mirror the lived experience of the kinds of people that we're trying to design for. So they're specialists in disability and neurodiversity and gender and race and certain religious practices. And I think what we're trying to do now, and also not only us, but I think there are other groups around the world. I'm here in Finland precisely for that, because we're collaborating with colleagues here in Scandinavia that I think who each in their own way are again trying to kind of reinvent and develop a new way of thinking that could think more broadly and more inclusively.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. So you can see how these new approaches, I mean, they have international implications. Many of these programs do, and it's causing us to think in very new and different ways about what the meaning of social equity is. And so when you're working in an innovation community, you really need to be open to these kinds of new ideas and programs and to testing them and implementing them. So, you know, if you were each to make a recommendation about a community like the Cove and creating, you know, social equity within an innovation community, knowing what you know through the work you've done, what would you like to see? I know I'm putting you on the spot. Marilynn.
I think one thing that I agree with the comment that was just made about involving the community, and that was noted earlier that the Cove did. But I think having spaces that not only have people live side by side, but also build community in a very, you know, sort of day-to-day way is really important. And there are models for that. I mean, there's a development up in Harlem that has, you know, $1 million apartments next to $250,000 apartments or less that, you know, that people might have gotten with. And the difference is, you know, one is a little bit bigger and it might have Viking stove and a, you know, fancy refrigerator and all of that, and maybe a wine cooler, and the other one is Kenmore, a GE, you know. But the point is that people have the opportunity to be with each other, to participate in things like, you know, the residence council, together to understand each other's dreams and aspirations. And traditionally, communities, the data show that communities like these historically have proven to be an aspirational basis for people to really sort of pull themselves up. The other thing that I would just mention quickly is that in reaching out to communities, particularly distressed communities, and creating opportunity, one needs to realize as well that there are elements in those distressed communities that someone said earlier, you know, they don't go around with little Labradors, with Labrador retrievers with bandanas. I mean, you know, people may have had experience with the criminal justice system, and there are other issues. Early childhood education is important, and I really applaud efforts both in the Cove and among my co-panelists who are trying to get at that. But there are contributions that can be made and stability to the neighborhood that can be created if it's sort of a panoply of interventions.
Yeah, and if you have that diversity of people living and working together, and you have gathering places, they meet each other, you know, I mean, in New York City, the restaurants and coffee shops are living rooms, right?
Right.
We go there to socialize, meet new people, talk to the bartender when you're lonely, right? You just, and the programming, you know, also is an important component to educating people about the different ways that people live their lives or the needs that they have, right?
I think coming from the work that I do is outside of the classroom. We do work with classrooms, but a lot of the learning is done in informal spaces. So I think once the Cove the laboratories are ready, I think that's such an opportunity to bring in young students to just see what the space is like, and then potentially have programming as well for them to experience what it is like to work in a biotech laboratory, right, or in a life sciences laboratory.
Yeah.
There's a lot of opportunity there. Yeah.
Yeah, and allowing them to participate in the hands-on experience of playing with emerging technologies, and it helps them to understand it more and feel like they're more part of the larger picture.
Dave?
Well, I've done quite a bit of work in China, and we opened a center about 5 years ago, quite a big one, in the Suzhou Innovation Park, which is one of the oldest and biggest mixed-use industrial, scientific industrial parks in China. But there they added the learning center, the sort of science center museum, after they had built this park. So when you asked what could you do to stimulate diversity in education, I would say you're doing exactly the right thing already, because you've aligned yourself and you're next door to a great science center, which in turn is doing something very innovative and having its own
Right.
biotech incubator and STEM high school. So I would say you're doing everything exactly right to have a mixed-use scientific innovation education center.
Is that good to hear, Clay? Yes, thank you. Appreciate that. And Joel, how about you? You know, what are I know you talked about needing to kind of engage the community, create surveys. What kinds of attributes would you like to see based on the work that you've done and the knowledge that you have from your colleagues implemented at the Cove for accessibility for diverse groups?
Yeah. Well, I guess what I would say is that building on what my colleagues are saying, what I'm hearing is that, you know, there has to be efforts made for community building that could take place through a variety of initiatives, educational initiatives, self-government, vocational training, etc. And all I would say is that I think that we not only need to avoid displacing, but that we need to create a sense of place, inclusive space, so that not only do we provide housing or provide classrooms or provide laboratories or provide community spaces for exchange and self-governance, but that we have to be careful to make sure that these spaces are not just generic, right? And do not just meet the needs of a kind of default able-bodied, white, cisgendered male user, which I think architecture traditionally designs for, almost by default or unconsciously, but that by engaging the specific demographics of the end users who are going to use these particular spaces to design them in a way that will make them safe, accessible, inclusive, so that these initiatives, these practices, which my colleagues are talking about, which are so important, okay, can take place. Right?
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. Is this resonating with you? I know we've got a lot of builders and engineers in the audience, and I'm wondering if any of you have a response to what you're hearing today, because this is actually quite revolutionary in terms of the way that developments happen and the way that they're designed, right? So what do you think?
This is more of a comment / question in response to that, which is, do you anticipate, thanks, wow. Do you anticipate any unforeseen consequences of bringing work and play together? You know, having work so central in a community.
Meaning that the people who are living there are assumed to be working across the street. Is that right? Yeah.
I did that for a while. Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, where we have housing on campus, and many people do it for years and years and years. I had to move away a little bit, but I think the experience worldwide is that this is the way that people want to live in the future, which is to be close to things, walk to places. But building slightly on that is, I think the biggest effect that you can have by having a well-organized, clean, fancy scientific community is that you welcome people into it.
Right.
Because a lot of students, especially young people, but also people of all ages, they don't have the opportunity to always come into a clean, well-ordered scientific place. And the mere act of welcoming them inside is probably as big effect as having them do an experiment or whatever activity you're going to do. So here you have that opportunity of welcoming lots of kind of people into an obviously innovative space. And you can't discount that simple activity.
I agree with that wholly, because again, historically, innovation centers have been, or innovation communities have been off-putting, not inclusive of people, so of people who are not scientists, even if they may aspire to become scientists if they only knew. So the transformational aspect, I think, is important. I think also, to the point of sort of the way things are going, what it does also respond to some of the financial imperatives of building some of these, you know, you need more density. You need to get the sort of amenities that people want. You have to be able to deliver something to your financial backers. You may have a very complex capital stack for these projects that involves not just private equity or capital, but also from philanthropy, from, you know, government, that will respond to and feed each of the components that you're trying to capture in a single project. So I think all of those together really do call for dense projects that can, and they're also environmentally more, I mean, we know about that, you know, they're also environmentally more sustainable. So I think all of that in general calls for, will lead to the kind of work-play environment. But again, I think as long as you have access in some way, whether or not one lives there or whether or not one is able to move beyond, means that the space itself can respond to people who at a different point in their lives may want to have something that, you know, the work-play experience very, very close together.
Yeah, it strikes me that having, living and working on a campus like Cold Spring Harbor can be insular, right? Whereas in a community like this, if you're inviting the Jersey City in, then you are really getting kind of a diversity of perspectives and programming and whatnot that you might not get on a Cold Spring Harbor, which is kind of the older model of a research park, right? As well as an academic institution.
It's really just an academic institution.
Okay, yeah.
Can I?
Does that answer your question, Kate? Good. Anybody else have thoughts or comments? Yes.
Well, first off, I want to just compliment the program because everything has kind of really meshed well as far as the different ideas. And I've been texting myself notes about this one. So I'm going to try to piece it together. The first part was kind of in response, and these are more like comments, in response to kind of Joel's ideals that he was presenting. I kind of resonated with some of those, and I think I'm on the same page as far as, you know, not necessarily placing him in a standard as far as design is concerned.
Right.
Because as he was speaking, I was thinking about like standards are more or less, you know, checkpoints and stopgaps. Like you interrupt your design process to comply, right? And that's not natural as far as, you know, giving something to an end user. You know, thinking of the end user. Wrote down, instead of necessarily complying with inclusion and diversity, you know, treating these components like detours, right, in the design process. You know, have the users of these spaces as a destination to kind of pave a clearer path through that design process. So I thought that was something I really resonated with right there. And then also tying back to when Liberty Science Center was here speaking about their program, it wasn't, they have the magnet program. It's not performance-based, but more interest-based, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I?
Dan?
Science education and science communication tends to be a one-way street, where those with the Innovation Center and the education kind of share it with the population, but there isn't necessarily an influence that goes back. So how do you turn a place like the Cove into kind of a two-way street, where the population of Jersey City and maybe greater New Jersey and New York City actually affect the research agenda or the activities that go on in a space like this?
That is probably one of the most central questions of our time, right?
Yeah.
If all of us in this room think about the ethical issues that are arising from biology today, like should we edit the germline, the human germline? This is not just a scientific fictional question. This is a question that the scientists are grappling with today, and we need our citizens to understand what the implications of those kinds of questions and issues are. Because if we don't, we as a society can't make decisions about how we want to live and evolve. So that is really key. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree. BioBuilder also pays attention to that, and I'm working on a project with Stanford and the D School where we are trying to introduce the idea of synthetic biology to students. And these are students who are not going to be biologists. So they're just, the idea behind it is that emerging technology affects all of us. And so, how do you find a way to introduce technology to people who are maybe skeptical or are not going to be engineers or scientists or biologists? It's just a way of finding ways to engage with them so that they feel like they can ask the right questions or ask questions, rather than just be afraid.
Right.
And I think part of that, which I think BioBuilder does too, and that we do, is actually getting the students to do some of the science, right? Like even if it's like extracting DNA from a strawberry, right? Like a very simple protocol, but it's something that they get their hands on. It's a hands-on activity, and then they can see how that translates to like the higher level thinking that the scientists in the research labs are doing. So like being able to do that work and then understand the importance of it, and like being able to imagine out what that looks like.
So one of the things I thought was so interesting about your competition last year was these students are in the middle of a pandemic. Mm-hmm. They have to create these projects by themselves, essentially, and do these experimentation and then present it to the world, essentially.
Yeah.
And the themes that were coming out, like human beings with mushrooms in them, growing all over them, right? Was really interesting. I mean, that is a way of hearing back, right, from the students and from the public. They're expressing themselves about science and how their fears and their apprehensions about what's happening to them in this way, but they're expressing it in kind of a scientific way, right? So it does give us something back.
Yeah, and something that we also do is, besides like trying to get the students in the lab, is the actual scientific research part of it too, right? So if they are creating a speculative project where humans are, coexisting with the environment and starting to mesh
Or was
with
it jellyfish? I forgot.
There's a lot. There's scales. There's great things. But I think we always ask them to find the scientific evidence of, we call them scientific breadcrumbs, right? So you are imagining a world where humans are living on Mars and they're planting their deceased family members' DNA into a grove to remember them, right, as a ritual. But we ask, where's the science now that leads to that sort of storytelling? Mm-hmm. So there's not always in the lab work, but there's always scientific research. And I think the practice of just reading a scientific journal, a paper, is a really important skill that I think isn't always taught in schools, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Any final thoughts from Joel or any of the other panelists?
Yes, I have a thought. Hello?
Yes, we're here.
Yes, yes, yes. I just, I hope I'm not backtracking, but I just wanted to return to the gentleman whose name I don't know who raised the comment about design standards. And I just wanted to thank him for that comment and just reinforce that point by saying that, we believe, strongly that we need to avoid creating prescriptive standards that sort of impose values on people. I think we and others have sort of investigated the way in which norms and standards tend to reinforce and meet the needs of standard bodies or normal bodies. And actually, that in the name of let's say, science or function or public health, they actually reinforce and exclude those who don't meet norms or standards. And for this reason, we recommend that design process, that we create not standards or guidelines, but recommendations that are at least in part derived from end user feedback, and that these are recommendations that could be adapted on a case-by-case basis to meet the site-specific and culturally contextual needs of the populations that live there. So I just really appreciate that point.
Thank you. Thanks, Jill.